Well, excellent job on Chapter 16, another long module that we just completed on appraisal and valuation. The exam does consist of a number of questions from this chapter, so you will see you need to be very familiar with this chapter. Make sure it's at the top of your priority list when you review and study preparing for the exam. Of course, in this chapter, we discussed what value is, and value can mean many things to many different people. A real estate broker will have an estimation of value, just like an insurance company will have an estimated of value. The county collector or assessor will have a value that they place on the property for what your property should be taxed for. The court may have a value if they were condemning your property and taking it for public use through an eminent domain or condemnation lawsuit. So value can mean many things to many different people, but we need to understand that for value to exist, we need to remember the acronym DUST, D-U-S-T. And of course, we have all of the information here for dust. We have demand. There must be some demand for the property. Demand also affects the kind of value real estate will have. 20 acres in the example in your book in the middle of nowhere will not have the same kind of value that 20 acres in a downtown city or next to a major highway might have. For anything to have value or real estate to have value, it has to have utility or some kind of usefulness. And of course, scarcity is another characteristic of value. We all remember what happened to many of us remember, I should say, years ago when Cabbage Patch dolls were very popular, but yet there was a small demand. I mean, a small supply, but there was a large demand of Cabbage Patch dolls. You had this scarcity of the product, so value naturally went up. And of course, it has to be easily transferable for real estate to have value. So DUST is a good acronym for you to remember, just to check through the items that, what kind of demand is there for this? Is there some usefulness or utility? Is it scarce? I mean, what's the supply and demand for the property? And can you easily transfer it, or transferability? So that is a good acronym for you to help remember the various aspects of value. Now, we also talked about market value and market price, and you can see some information right here on the screen and in your textbook. You need to understand that both buyer and seller are typically motivated. They're well informed. There's been some considerable amount of time for the real estate being sold to be available to the open market. Payments are made in cash or comparable financial arrangements, and there's no special financing involved. I have a property I just listed last night, and I showed the property today to a potential buyer. If the buyer was to make, which they did, a low cash offer, and the seller was to accept that, we may not want to, we may have to make some adjustments. That may not actually be what we would consider market value. Why? Because this little bullet point right here, has it been on the market for a considerable length of time? The opposite is true. If a property's been on the market for a long time and it has not sold, and then it finally sells, you kind of have to take all of these things into consideration. If I said to you, I'll finance my house with 0 down and 2% interest for 20 years, I might be able to get a higher price than normal if these financing terms were not in play. In other words, I might be willing to pay a little bit more for this property because of your financing terms. However, if you're going to make me go to the bank and use my money and get conventional financing, then I probably may want to offer a little less or closer to the list price. So that's when we talk about no special financing considerations if the seller made some very, very attractive financing terms, as I just pointed out. Perhaps that property sold for a little bit more than it really is worth. So you can look at some of the information here in your textbook about market value, market price. Some of that information I would definitely go over. We have some definitions. Anticipation. Naturally, values can go up or down if there's an anticipation of certain events that may happen. Supply and demand. We talked about Cabbage Patch dolls earlier, but the iPhone, when it comes out and they all sell out, then naturally prices may go up for those. Super Bowl tickets, when there's only a limited number of tickets, the supply is limited, and the demand is high, prices go up. The law of substitution, right here, the third one down, talks about all things are equal. Consumers will consider all things equal in a specific neighborhood. So let me kind of explain how the law of substitution works. If you had house A, house B, house C, and house D, they're in the same neighborhood. They are all equally in the same neighborhood, equal in size. All other things are similar. However, house number D has put a lot of extra features in their home. Granite countertops, high-end windows, big patio, swimming pool. They have actually spent a lot of money on extra items. What the law of substitution says is the consumer will not necessarily want to pay that higher price if all things are equal. Therefore, the maximum value of a property tends to be set by its competition that is also for sale. So what this means is D, even though they have a lot of money invested, they're going to have to put their price in line with these other three, because consumers just won't, in most cases, spend the extra money for that if all of the other homes in the neighborhood are only worth a certain amount of money. The law of contribution says that the value will be measured by the amount that is either added to the property or takes away from the value. A lot of times you have to explain this to consumers because there are some items that you might put into a property. Let's say, for example, new windows. You may spend a lot of money for those new windows. However, is that going to contribute this same amount of money that you spent? Not always. New carpeting, new painting tend to contribute more to the value than, say, new windows, or if you had to go and replace floor joists below the property because they're rotted out, or rafters in the roof. See, those kinds of things consumers expect to already be done. So you may not get your value back for that. So the principle of the law of contribution says the value will be measured by the amount that it either adds to the property or takes away. And so a lot of times consumers say, gosh, I just had all of this foundation work done, and I spent a lot of money getting the floors leveled and this and that, and they spent all of this money, but it's not necessarily going to add a lot of value back to the property. The law of regression and progression just says that I like to always kind of refer to this, that if you have a small house in a neighborhood where there are big homes, the law of progression says they will bring your property value up. But The reverse can happen with the law of regression, in that if you are the biggest kid on the block or the biggest home on the block, then your value tends to be brought down. So pretty easy to remember there. Progression, property values go up. They will bring your property value up. Regression, they will take your property value down. You can also see the law of increasing and diminishing returns. What this means, and this is an economic principle that says at some point you can produce so many goods that regardless of how much money you continue to put in you put in the marketplace, you won't get that money back. And this is a good example that kind of goes along with this law of contribution. You know, we talked about, or actually let me go back up here to the law of substitution, where consumers will pretty much substitute the property. You know, even though you've done a lot of work to your property, because these other homes in the neighborhood are already much less than your property value, it's going to pull your property down. Well, the law of diminishing returns, increasing and diminishing returns, says that you can keep putting money in your house, but at some point your house is only going to be worth so much money in that area. So you know, that's the max that area will normally happen, and if you just keep putting money in your property, you're not going to get it back. I was talking to a friend the other day. He was telling me in their area that there are a lot of people that have built these 750,000 to $1 million properties, but when they go to put them back on the market, they're only selling for about $490. He said they can't break a $500,000. So you can see that $500,000 would be this point right here, and regardless of what you put over that, you're not going to get it back. Conformity says property values tend to be higher for a property as it conforms with other homes in the neighborhood. That's what you always want to look at. Try to price your property. We have some other definitions here on highest and best use. Competition, where property values will spill over. I have seen this, these two words, tend to see those on the exam a lot. Plottage is when you put several lots together. So when you're putting several lots together, you're going to help the value go up. And the example we have is you take a 100 by 150 lot on a major highway, you can't do much with it. But if you put 3 or 4 lots through plottage together, now you can put a fast food restaurant, a car lot, and much more. Same way with assemblage, it is what we call the process. So that is the process of plotting the lots together. And of course, change can happen. A tornado could go through a small town that at one time needed lots of buildings tore down, and because of the natural disaster, people rebuild, and there are new sidewalks and new lights and new houses and new construction, and now everything's changed, and values will definitely change with that as well. Now as we go down, we have 3 different types of approaches we will look at. The market data sales comparison approach, and you have information in your notes. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this. It is very important for you to study, but as far as the recap goes, I just want you to understand that the market data or sales comparison approach, which is interused, so it could be called this, it can also be called the sales comparison approach, is ideal for single-family residential homes. It's also good for vacant land. And why? Because it compares the subject property to other similar properties that have sold. So you can see that, you know, as we look at comparables, there's lots of information down here that you can read. We're looking at location, at the physical characteristics, and the time frame that it's been on the market. Naturally, you wouldn't want to pick properties that have sold 3 years ago. because the market's changed since then. You wouldn't want to compare a two-story home to a ranch home, two different types of properties. And you wouldn't want to compare a house that's on this side of town with a house in a totally different neighborhood on the other side of town. It's not good to do. So know that, understand about making adjustments. We have that information here for you, and just want to recap very quickly for you that we'll just look at this. If you were appraising a home with a two-car garage and the home next door sold last month but only had a one-car garage, but everything else was the same, what would you conclude? The conclusion is, if the property that had already sold, the house next door, if it had a two-car garage, it would have probably sold for more money. Therefore, you add value to that home as if it had a two-car garage, and we add $8,000. So you can see we're looking at this comparable that sold for $60,000, and we're saying, wait a minute, if that house had had a two-car garage, maybe it would have sold for $68,000. So we make an adjustment to the comparable. We're always making adjustments to the comparable property. You know, the question comes up here, why don't you make the adjustments to the subject property? And the answer is because the house we're trying to place a value on, we have no idea at this stage what its value could be, so we're not able to adjust the subject. We can only make adjustments to the comparable property. So I have a little item here for you to remember. If the comparable's lacking a feature, then you add. If it has more, you would subtract. So you want to kind of make sure that you can work through these adjustments. Here's an example. This is our subject property. This is a property you're doing the appraisal on, or the CMA. It's in fair location, but notice comparable number one's in a good location. So remember, more equals less, less equals more. So fair location, comparables in a good location. We always make adjustments to what? The comparables. So more or better, good location, fair location, so more equals less. We're saying if comparable number one had been in a fair location, it probably would have sold for $4,500 less. Let's look at comparable number two. No central air. But our subject has central air. Less equals more. No central air, less features. Add. We want to add. So this is, kind of one of those areas you have to think about and work through. But as you make your comparables, remember, more, if the subject property has better or more, you're going to subtract value. If the subject property does not have, if the comparable property does not have something the subject property has, then you would add value. So always make adjustments to the comparables. More, good location, better location, subtract. Comparable number two, no central air, less features than our subject property. Because it has central air, we're going to add. You need to know that for the exam because you may have a question on that. Now we talk about the cost approach, which is a great approach for the commercial type, Now we're talking about the cost approach, which is ideal for special purpose type properties. A church, a city hall. Now a new home also works well for the cost approach because, as you will see, what we're really trying to do is reconstruct the building, deduct depreciation, never depreciate land, and add the land value back. So it's good for new homes, but it's also ideal for special purpose type properties. Now, as you can see, we have an example here, $4,500 land value. We take the home, which is 1,800 square feet times $50 a square foot, 90,000 new to build. We deduct our depreciation. We get 68,000. We do not depreciate land, so now we're going to add our land value back up, and we have $72,000 value. That's through the cost approach. Know what these items are here. Again, definitions, very important, will help you pass the exam because they will throw these questions in. This is another good example here, the quantity survey method, unit and place method. Make sure you understand all of these, and also make sure you understand the depreciation forms. We've already talked about this in your class, and again, this is just a quick review, but physical deterioration can fall into curable and incurable, and so you want to make sure that you understand the curable and the incurable side. Also, functional obsolescence, it's outdated materials. That too can be curable and incurable. And then we have external or environmental depreciation. And I always like to remind folks that external or environmental depreciation, you have no control over this situation. It's outside the property lines, okay? Notice that both physical and functional fall within the property lines, but external and environmental fall outside the property lines. So you've got the cost approach, ideal for special purpose type properties and also brand new homes. And then we have the income approach. We've worked through some of these problems already in this chapter, but this is ideal for income producing properties, and you can kind of go through some of the information that's there. Again, remember, with the income approach, we're really looking at the rate of return or the cap rate. So some very good information there. I would know and learn. I would understand how to do the gross rent multiplier, because you will probably see, definitely know you will see some cap rate problems and probably a gross rent multiplier problem on the exam. And then the other definitions we have here, you want to make sure that you know all of these. Very important to know. I'm just going to highlight those. What's effective age? What's actual age? Economic life, physical life. And then know the stages of a neighborhood. I've seen questions on that as well. Very important for you to know that. You have growth, stability, decline, and revitalization. It's interesting. There's a neighborhood subdivision I drive through, and early in my real estate career, that was the go-to subdivision. And so, you know, I remember watching that subdivision go through the growth stage and the new properties. And in fact, my wife and I purchased a home in there and raised our children over there. And we were probably in the subdivision during this stability stage. The growth had kind of taken over and was gone, and they completed the subdivision. So we lived there in the stability stage, but now when I drive through, I can kind of see the subdivision is almost going into a declining stage. It's interesting, but at some point, that same subdivision will revitalize and take off and be very, very popular again. So every neighborhood has those 4 cycles, and they like that question on the test. And they love this question here. What's the first and last part of an appraisal? Number 1, state the problem. And number 2, you write, the last part is you write the report. Remember that you never average your comps. You always want to put the most weight, and you never average the 3 different types of appraisal values we went through. You want to put the most weight with the type of property you're doing the appraisal on. So if it's a special purpose type property, you're probably going to put most of your weight in the cost approach. If it's an apartment building and you can find some other comps of apartments in the area, that's great, but you're probably going to put your most weight into the income approach. If it's a single family home, you're probably going to put the most weight into the sales comparison or market data approach. Never, ever average. A lot of information in this chapter. It's very important for you to go over, to be familiar with the three various types of appraisal methods, know how to do the cap rate problems, how to do the gross rent multiplier problems. Make sure you understand how to make adjustments for depreciation. There will be some questions on there. And again, they're going to be real similar to properties where they're going to give you information. You're going to have to figure out, was that physical or was that economic? And they may give you, just as a heads up, they might give you a problem with a lot of information and give you depreciation for all three types of depreciation. But then the question asks you for only two types of depreciation. So you've got to be able to look in that problem and say, even though they gave me all three, the question wants to know what was the functional and economic depreciation taken. And so read those questions carefully and make sure you're able to identify what's functional, what's physical, what's environmental, and then go with the correct answer, because I guarantee you answer A is the one they want you to try to go for, and it has all three choices. But answer B, C, or D will only have the two types of depreciation, and that's what they're asking you for. So the correct answer is D. But a lot of people will jump on A because they see all of this depreciation, but they forget to find out, what are they really wanting me to answer? So read the questions carefully. Make sure you are familiar with all of this information. Spend a lot of time studying valuation. It's a very, very important chapter, and you will do just fine on the exam. Well, that wraps up chapter 16, and a lot of ink scratching on that specific review. But you are doing a great job, and after you pass the review quiz that's coming up, you can move on to chapter 17.